Welcome to Energy Unplugged, your go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. I'm Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America. My guest today is Andy Bowman. If there's one thing I know about Andy, it's that he's a man that wears many hats. A lawyer by training, he is a serial clean energy entrepreneur, currently the CEO of grid-scale battery storage company Jupiter Power. He is an adjunct professor at UT Austin Law School, and he is the author of the book, The West Texas Power Plant That Saved the World, which I'm looking forward to digging into a little today. Andy, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So one thing that really struck me about reading your book was the extent to which the energy transition has really been something of a central theme right throughout your life. Certainly it's been the focus of your career, but even before that, at a very young age, you talk about how your experience growing up not too far from here in Galveston, Texas, really started you down this path. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think that anybody who grows up on an island has a special awareness of, Mother Nature, and especially, how powerful she can be, and especially when things are going wrong. Galveston is kind of famous for the hurricanes that come through the Gulf of Mexico. In the book, I talk about how growing up in Galveston, the story of the 1900 storm, and then the response to the storm that followed is pretty much everywhere. You learn about it at school and at the library and all kinds of other places. And I think that really orients anyone to keeping an eye on the weather and being aware of changes, and having a special awareness about the bad things that can happen.
Totally. And I suppose you started out your career as a lawyer, but very quickly you joined a wind energy startup. I think this was in the late 1990s. And not long after, you started your own business with a couple of friends. I suspect it's hard to imagine for folks today looking back, but at the time, wind energy in the US was basically non-existent. We're talking 1-2 gigawatts max of installed capacity. So here you come, basically touring the country, trying to sell landowners, investors on this idea of how they could make money from this, I suppose what was an outlandish new technology at the time. I'm curious what some of those early conversations were like.
The wind business started in the U.S. In the kind of late 80s and early 90s. There was a company called Kinetec that had taken over for U.S. wind power, and there had been several projects built in places like Vermont and California. But that wave of growth in the industry kind of died in the mid 90s. And it wasn't a very sustainable model. Looking at the passage of the investment tax credit or the production tax credit in the early 90s, that kind of set the industry on a different trajectory. And the first project that I was involved with was out in West Texas, a project called Southwest Mesa. And the conversations that we had to have with landowners and with government officials about the type of project that we wanted to build there, when there really weren't any others to point at. There was one project way out in further West Texas that was actually a Kinetec project. But that was kind of it for many hours drive in any direction. And so talking to people about wanting to build the types of machines that we had in mind was very difficult. People, of course, in that part of the country knew about wind power. They knew about windmills, but the type of turbines that we were talking about on 60, 70, 80 meter towers, tens or hundreds of them, and putting them where it was windiest on top of the mesas out in West Texas. It was very surreal. And we were lucky that I think people took us seriously. after working on the first projects in Texas, we started working in other parts of the country, and we did, land development in Oregon and Colorado and New Mexico, Pennsylvania and Alabama and Georgia, all over Texas. And people, just as a matter of course, had no idea what we were talking about, and we would have to kind of explain, what was involved. But the legal structure for getting the land rights that we needed had a very attractive royalty clause. And the one thing that we could communicate was, even if it was a very new concept for doing something like this on their land, it was something that a landowner could, receive good compensation for, and that, that compensation would last for, the leases that we were signing were 30 or 40 years or more. So I think they could take some comfort in the fact that if the things that we were talking about were to come to pass, it was a good economic proposition for them. And the same from a governmental point of view. These were very capital intensive projects, and we would be paying a lot of taxes. And so people tended to give us the benefit of the doubt. But it was a lot of, really long conversations over months and years with many of these stakeholders, and ones where we had to do a lot of education.
I'm curious if how the extent to which that's got easier today or more difficult. I suppose your focus right now is on battery storage, which certainly has a smaller land footprint in any case.
Yeah. I think that wind project development has evolved, enormously over the last 25 years or so. It went from being, a brand new concept that it was difficult to convey to people, the types of projects that we had in mind, something that's pretty well known, and then something that has come to encounter a lot more kind of organized resistance in certain parts of the country. Solar was technology that, again, we had to have a whole bunch of new conversations with people who had never seen projects like those before. They're very different from a wind project. It's much more intensive use of land, whereas a wind project just has a few turbines, across a large ranch. With solar panels, you're really, kind of putting them very close together, making a lot of other uses of the land difficult. So having those conversations was, involved a new level of education to people. Solar projects have also come to experience some resistance here and there. And now we've been doing energy storage for the last several years at Jupiter, and that also is a very different conversation. A lot of information to landowners and stakeholders about how these projects work, why they're useful to have, the role that they play in keeping a grid in good shape, all of those kinds of things. So it's been a journey, and it's kept it interesting for me to have all these different food groups over my career.
Yeah, I mean, clearly we've come a long way on that journey, and I think something you stress over and over again in the book, though, is almost the incomprehensible scale of the challenge, really. So, despite all of the gigawatts of wind and solar and batteries we've installed in the world over the last 20 years, collective efforts still fall short of what's needed to keep us, well, within the 2-degree target, let alone the 1.5-degree target. I think the metaphor you use in the book is it's a bit like needing to hit a grand slam, but only bunting a single. Can you expand on what you mean by that?
Yeah. It really is staggering how incredibly successful the renewable build over the last 25 years has been. Looking backwards today, the growth has just been unbelievable. And by most measures, one could feel a lot of satisfaction about how much progress has been made. I think all of the growth charts have shown, very steeply inclining numbers of megawatts and gigawatts. Here in Texas, over my career, it started with, just a handful of projects here and there, and now we're over 45 gigawatts of wind projects. We're on the way up from 10, 15, 20, and up from there, solar projects. There is an enormous amount of wind and solar that remains in process to come into the market here in ERCOT, and then lately, batteries are coming on the scene very quickly. And so, looking backwards, the progress that we have made has been, really incredible, and I think as well as anybody could have expected. The problem is that when you look forward, when you look at the levels of clean energy production that we really need, according to the UN IPCC, any kind of objective analysis to inhibit the greenhouse gas emissions that's so important to keeping the temperature goals within grasp. We're just nowhere near where it needs to be, and so it's a strange place to be, to have seen an industry grow so quickly and really orient itself for success on a number of fronts, from introducing new technologies to finding new ways to finance projects, to finding the right places to develop them and construct them, to successfully operating them as these new technologies and grids all over the country and North America and the world. I mean, those are incredible accomplishments. On the other hand, the amount of new clean energy generation that we need is just vastly more, and we're not getting it done quickly enough. So it's it's on the one hand, I think everybody that's been doing this kind of work can be proud of all the accomplishments. But we've really got to change the way that we're doing things to accomplish a lot more quickly.
Having said that, though, I think it's fair to say that you're still an optimist at heart, which perhaps is a nice segue to the title of the book. So, the West Texas power plant that saved the world. So, which power plant is it, and what exactly makes it such a cause for optimism?
Yeah, yeah. As much as one can know about the reality of climate change and kind of the trajectory that we're on, and I know the news yesterday was that the average global temperature for 2023 was 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And so that's actually the goal that we had under the Paris Agreement for 2030. Now, 1 year doesn't make or break, a sustained pattern, and I think there's a lot to lead us to believe that last year with El Nino was an unusually warm year, but it's certainly not a good sign. It's a really troubling sign, and there's a lot else, I think, for us to be concerned about with the rate of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in particular. However, I am optimistic, and as I write in the book, there's so much progress that we've made, and I think the path is really pretty clearly illuminated about the things that we need to do and our ability to get there. The heart of the story told in the book is about the Berea solar project, which was a little 14 megawatt solar project built in 2014. Project of that size, even back in 2014, is really not very notable. That's a pretty small project, and certainly by today's standards, it's even less notable, size wise. I mean, solar projects of 200, 300, 400, 500 megawatts are being constructed here and there, and the gross number of megawatts of solar being built is hard to describe still. Not just California and Arizona and Texas, very sunny states, but all over the rest of the country. But the story that's told there is kind of about how that happened. And Berea is the focus because it is the first solar project to have been built on a merchant basis, which is to say, without a long-term power purchase agreement in place prior to the project being constructed. That's notable because prior to Berea and solar's ascendancy, the only projects that would be built on spec like that without a long-term power purchase agreement in place were, the most dominant power generation technologies that we had, the most dominant in the market, and those were, really natural gas. So the appearance of the first solar merchant project I use as an example to make the case that, solar has arrived as the most market dominant way to generate power. And in fact, that's what we see today. You can look at many grids around the country and you see an enormous amount of solar preparing to make its way, through financing and construction and into operation. That's happening because the price that solar can generate at is extremely competitive. It's extremely competitive with natural gas fire generation, with coal generation, with nuclear generation, with wind power, just about everything that's out there that can be built new today. And so the Berea project, I think, shows how incredibly quickly we've improved the ability to generate clean energy. It comes on the back of wind, which had its own incredible story. But solar has much broader application. Even it produces all the power that we need, during the middle of the day when power usage is greatest. And I think if you project forward, what ends up being apparent about the solar story is that the ability to generate power so cheaply with no emissions has turned out to be the most effective tool that we've come up with so far for reducing greenhouse gases. And I think we've got a lot more of that. And it really shows that when you put it together with other new technologies, wind, energy storage, other potential solutions that are out there, new transmission is another one. It's really a pretty compelling package that we do have the tools that we need to make the progress that we need to make on emissions. We just need to, figure out how to get there and find the political will. And I think those things are ultimately also within our grasp. But that's a bit of a different question. But that's where I find my optimism with this.
So Berea, in a way, was emblematic of solar sort of finally being able to stand on its own 2 feet and compete in the market on an equal footing with conventional generation. If we zoom forward to today, I'm curious that, even though costs have come down pretty substantially over the past decade, fully merchant solar, so solar with no offtake agreement, is still very much a minority. Is that a fair assessment of the situation today?
Yes. The point that I make in the book is that Berea's emergence as a merchant plant shows that it's the cheapest power that can be generated. Now, whether that is the best way to build a solar project, to finance a solar project, is a different question. You can get more efficient financing for any power generation project by having a contract in place from a customer to buy the output. And as you say, the vast majority of solar projects being built today are, have a contract of one type or another. So the argument I was making in the book isn't that, there should be a lot more merchant solar. The argument in the book is that the solar has become the cheapest way to generate. And that's a good thing from a climate point of view. There's also a lot about the story of how solar became that way that I think is instructive for us about how to reach the rest of the goals that we have on climate change and for other technologies. I would say too that in the beginning of my career, your average power generation project, whether it was wind or gas or whatever, had a 20-year power purchase agreement with a major utility. Most offtake agreements, power purchase agreements, and other types of offtake agreements today are much shorter in term, have a variety of structures that are much more market oriented, that share different parts of risk between the generator and the buyer. Not that many depending on which market you're in, not that many of the offtake agreements have the customer as a major utility. There are a variety of other counterparties out there, including major corporate buyers, trading houses, banks providing hedge products and those kinds of things. And so another way to look at the merchant or not question is I do think that a lot of offtake agreements have been sliding in the direction of much more market oriented, much more market exposure for the generator, which again, I don't think you could build those types of projects if the technology you were building wasn't producing extremely competitively priced power. So.
Yeah, that's right. So it was more an argument about underlying economics rather than about capital structure or financing offtake agreements per se. That makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about capitalism and climate change. It's it's in the subtitle of your book, and I think a central theme of what you wrote is that capitalism has an important role not just in causing climate change, but also in combating it. I'm sure there are many people listening that are fully on board with that sentiment. Perhaps others not so much. So what argument are you making here?
Yeah, a lot of the challenge of addressing climate change comes down to hardware. The energy that we use every day, whether it's coming from a power plant, coming from an internal combustion engine, we're basically burning fossil fuels to create the heat or the expansive force that then through a steam turbine or whatever, ends up creating electricity or creating power to get work done. So at that level, a lot of the challenge that we have to address the emissions coming from all that hardware that we build is about replacing that hardware and building all the new hardware that we need to meet increasing energy consumption that we forecast down the road. And so really what we're looking at to make a lot of progress in reducing emissions is a giant infrastructure program. Infrastructure, like building roads and power plants and dams and that kind of thing. Today, more and more includes building the new types of power plants, building solar, building wind, building energy storage projects, building transmission lines, all of those things. At that level, climate change can be thought of as not just an environmental problem, not just a political problem, not just a social problem, but a problem of capital, an infrastructure problem. The way that you solve an infrastructure problem is access to capital. And I think that from that perspective, what we really need to do is find ways to attract the capital that we need to bring the solution forward. It's kind of crazy on the one hand to say that if you recognize that the capitalism that we have practiced, not just in the United States and other developed countries, but pretty much everywhere else around the world over the last X hundreds of years, has created a lot of the emissions, has really driven the emissions that have us in the situation that we're in today. To then turn to that as a potential solution is maybe counterintuitive. But to the extent that we have identified the ways to reduce emissions most effectively, and that those ways are new ways of generating electricity that is so important to everything that we do, that drives every economy, that drives every one of our personal lives all through the day, from the time we wake up through our work hours. Um, uh, Really, if we can change our capitalism, if we can kind of redirect it to be as effective at bringing the solution forward as it has been in creating the problem, I think from that perspective, it really can be an enormously beneficial tool, but it's contingent upon us getting it pointed in the right direction, which is a very different direction than it's been in the past.
Right. So part of your argument, I think, is that it's not markets per se that are the issue. It's things like, not pricing in the cost of pollution. So, one of the solutions you point to in the book is carbon pricing. Put a price on carbon, let markets do their thing, and redirect the sort of positive forces of capitalism in a sense, like you just said. Uh, at the same time, I think it's fair to say we've made fairly little progress on carbon pricing. Over the last few years, especially anywhere near to its social cost. Are you still optimistic on that front?
Yeah, I think carbon pricing is really essential. As you mentioned, it's really the main uh, correction to capitalism that needs to happen for capitalism to become, a benefit in managing the issues that we're facing with climate change. Um, uh, I think there has been a diverse level of support for putting a price on carbon politically. Um, Most of, for instance, the oil majors like Exxon Mobil, you can read their 10K, and there's a good amount of um, opinion expressed about the likelihood of a price on carbon at some point. Most major tech corporations, I think, would foresee some price on carbon happening at some point. I think most governments have talked a lot about it, and a lot of projections in the future about prices on carbon are put forward and discussed. So I think it's one of those things that a wide and diverse group of important players on policy matters do foresee happening. The question is when, and as you point out, there's nothing on the uh, in the presidential campaigns or in the Congress or elsewhere really to suggest that it's imminent. I think that is one of the hardest things about where we stand on climate change today, is that there's a lot of awareness about the problem. There's a lot of awareness about the actions that need to be taken to address it. And yet there is not the political will today to go ahead and take those actions. What is it going to take to get there? I do not have the answer to that question. I do worry that it's taking us so long. I would also say that price on carbon is a complicated tool. It if not done properly, it could amount to a pretty regressive tax, effectively. And so I think that the way that a price on carbon uh, is put together and is designed from a policy point of view and communicated to people is extremely important, and a huge part of how that political will is gonna happen. I do think, though, that it could be surprisingly easy to sell down the road, because some of the proposals, for instance, here in the U.S. are about basically, replacing big parts of the income tax with a carbon tax. And so you could see a big reduction. You could see carbon dividends paid to prevent the regressive tax element of a carbon tax. And those could be just such powerful policy directions, redirecting the flow of money in the economy away from things that are producing the emissions that are driving climate change and towards things that are creating the solutions.
Yeah, I think it's a good point around the distributional impact. It seems to be one of the challenges that a lot of people, if you ask them directly, care about climate change and want something to be done, but when it comes to willingness to pay for it, that that's when the rubber really hits the road. Which speaks to the importance of, continued tech innovation and making things cheap. So I think one of the big success stories that you highlight in the book is the huge cost reduction we've seen in solar panels over the last few decades, which you ascribe at least in part to the benefits of globalization. So you point to the US for its pioneering work early on in tech development, to Germany for driving demand for panels, and then to China for actually satisfying that demand with low cost production. I'm curious how much of that, is this a story of the success of free markets and globalization, or is it a story of, some combination of US state funded innovation and Chinese industrial policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, the story of how photovoltaics came together, that's told in the middle of the book is I find it just so fascinating, because so many different parts of the world had such critical roles in the story, over the entire course of, more than 100 years. Um, I think the question of how it relates to globalism and how that has changed over the last, decade or so, and what that foretells about where we're going from here is a really important um, perspective on the whole thing. I do think that um, there there was something about the way that uh, governments uh, around the world, particularly in Europe and the United States and Asia and China in particular, were finding ways to do business together, particularly in the 2000s and the early 2010s. That was just the most momentous part of the price reduction that occurred in photovoltaics. As you mentioned, it was really some pretty unique circumstances about the way the German solar market was designed that resulted in a soaring demand there, and it was demand so great that the German manufacturers looked to China for ways to increase the supply, and particularly the cheap supply of panels. That kind of began a pattern that was then accelerated when the financial crisis and the Chinese government's response to that, that really prioritized solar as one of the big industries for growth. What happened after that was a capturing of the economies of scale in manufacturing that reduced year on year massive price reductions in solar panel manufacturing that then went out into the market, and it's that pattern that ended up providing such an incredible price advantage for solar panels, that led to Berea, and then that's led to the growth of solar since then. Um, Parts of the world are interacting very differently today, obviously, and from one perspective, it's quite understandable. When you look at trade relations between the United States and China, for instance, there are a lot of issues, very credible issues around trade fairness and around um, uh, you know um, subsidization and how governments compete for industries, technology transfer, some very real issues there. Um, from another perspective, if you're looking at the world through the lens of climate change and greenhouse gas reduction, um, there's a case to be made that what came up through all of this story of solar is a really efficient allocation of resources, where Chinese government policy was able to put large amounts of Chinese taxpayer funds to work internally to create and availability of capital to manufacturers there that created cheaper and cheaper panels that were then made available to the rest of the world. From that perspective, what solar panels ended up being was an incredible, cheap, clean way to generate power in the United States and elsewhere, that had at its source, a large deployment of taxpayer money through Chinese industrial policy. Where will things go from here? And in the world that we're looking at, in the way that the United States and China are interacting, for instance, and in Europe as well. This is a really important question, because if we're going to make the kind of progress that we need, there's an incredibly, strong case to be made that the world's biggest emitters, between Europe, the United States, and China in particular, a number of other countries are growing quickly in their emissions, but those really are the major contributors, both historically and today. If those countries can't work together to put their respective strengths to work, to get the things done that we need to get done, then obviously success will be a lot harder. And so I think that the story of solar has a lot to say, good and bad, about the ways that the different parties interacted to end up with the result, which was this extremely powerful, the most powerful tool that we've had to reduce emissions. And I think that, one of my recommendations going forward is that no matter what the disputes are between these major powers in the world, it would be ideal if we could find a way to segregate out our trade interactions on proven, well-known technologies that are really effective at reducing greenhouse gases. It would be good to separate those out so we can continue to get things done that we need to get done on that front, even as we sort out the other conflicts that we have with each other around the world.
I'm curious how you think about the IRA in this context, the Inflation Reduction Act. So, for me, one of the most significant aspects of the IRA is that it signals something of a shift in U.S. policy away from globalization and benefiting from the global specialization and competitive benefits that you're talking about, and towards a more nationally focused industrial policy. So in essence, implicit in the IRA is the willingness to trade off, I suppose, some degree of economic efficiency in support of domestic labor, domestic manufacturing, and presumably slightly higher costs that will come with that. Do you think that's the right trade-off to be making?
Yeah, I think there is so much great about the Inflation Reduction Act, coming out of COVID in particular, and the supply chain disruptions that affected every major industry around the world. One of the IRA's biggest effects is in really improving the supply chain for major equipment in the energy sector, and particularly for the energy being built at the quickest rate. As I've said, that's a lot of solar, a lot of wind, a lot of batteries. There's a lot in the IRA as well to help nuclear power continue on. There's so much done there that is going to be really, really effective at helping these major technologies proceed and get constructed. I think that part of it is really wonderful. I think the parts of the legislation that take a very thoughtful approach to increasing the demand for manufacturing here in the United States and manufacturing in our close allies is also really valuable and a really important part of the legislation. All of that is really great, and I think also from a tax incentive point of view, getting the investment tax credits and production tax credits with a good long window is really wonderful. As you note, though, I think there is also a nationalistic aspect to the legislation, and I think that that's a great feature in many ways because it does emphasize the benefit for growing manufacturing jobs here in the U.S. and a lot of the equipment that we need to be deploying here. It being available to buy from factories here in the U.S. is is a really great achievement of the legislation. To some degree, though, it's expecting that we can create factories here kind of overnight or in a short period of time that are going to be immediately competitive with facilities that have years, if not a decade or more of lead time uh, elsewhere in the world. And so, how well are these manufacturing facilities here going to be able to compete with more, established competitors? I think that's really central to the purpose of the legislation. I think we've got a great opportunity to get that done. And for instance, at Jupiter, we're very eager to secure our domestic supply agreements for new battery equipment. And if you look across the United States, there's a huge number of battery manufacturing plants that are in process in one stage or another. But I think, to the extent that we have such problems agreeing on policy directions at the political level when it comes to climate change, I think that that business and corporate progress has been a way kind of around those fights. I think that renewables being the cheapest way to get energy has allowed us to make a lot of progress, irrespective of the political divide, and that really relies on this equipment driving the case. It being the cheapest solution out there. We're securing all the advantages of clean energy without having to, have a debate about whether climate change is real or, what kind of level of progress we should be making. To the extent we are seeing with the IRA ways to keep this equipment being the cheapest that it can be, I think that's a huge benefit. If what we're heading to is more of a go it alone, and every nation is going to manufacture its own equipment and forego the benefits of equipment available from elsewhere, I think that would be heading us in the wrong direction.
I think that's a good point. Just to touch briefly on battery storage in the US, Jupiter is growing quickly. How are you seeing the market in the US right now? I suppose CAISO and ERCOT are probably the most attractive markets for US batteries today. Where's the next wave of investment coming?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. CAISO has been the leader. I think the energy storage business has really grown there very substantially. ERCOT has come on more recently, and the level of growth of energy storage here in ERCOT has been extraordinary. At Jupiter, we do development all across the country. We have certain markets that we're more focused on than others. But we really see storage as growing pretty consistently across just about all markets. And the reason why is really, has to do with the same dynamic that we've been discussing so far. The more renewables that get out there, the greater the value of something that can store some of that power on a particularly windy or during the sunniest part of the day, and that can then make that power available at a time when it's not windy or it's not sunny. The other factor that's driving energy storage, not just in ERCOT and California but elsewhere, is that we've basically been seeing kind of an inversion of the transmission system over the last 20 years or so. It used to be that in a major city, you had power plants around that city that served the needs of the city. And you had power lines connecting to other big load pockets, other big cities and their power plants. And that's the way that our grid came together originally. What we've been seeing with the energy transition is we've been seeing more and more generation coming from remote areas, from renewables, from solar and wind projects that are not in downtown, in a downtown metropolis. And we've been seeing the thermal plants in the big load pockets become less competitive, and many of them have been closing down. And so what you're seeing in a lot of these big load pockets is a loss of generation that that the economic case for the way it's been generated hasn't been strong, and yet there's still a need for generation in those big load pockets. And so there's a real opportunity for storage to grow as kind of the backup power and the regular filling in of the gaps for renewables coming in from afar, and managing the transmission constraints between a lot of the generation that's coming from remote areas into big cities and other big load pockets. So over time, we're seeing the same factors that are driving the energy transition as driving an increasing need and an increasing market for energy storage. And we would see that is happening, more or less in all the grids around the country over, it's kind of the question is what would be the period of time that opportunity would emerge.
I think that's right. It's hard to overstate just how much the storage market is booming in the US right now. Probably 50% of our projects over the last 24 months have been storage transactions. So certainly one to keep an eye on. One of the ways we sometimes like to wrap up these episodes is with a quick fire round of under or overrated. I'm going to quickly list 4 things, and you, Andy, will tell me if you think they're under or overrated. So first up is the chances of repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act.
I think this is underrated. I think that we're looking at an uncertain politics over the next year, obviously, and it's already been an objective of the majority in the House to repeal it. And I don't think it's likely, but I think it's an underrated concern.
I'd like to talk more about that one, but it's a whole separate podcast. Second is the nuclear renaissance.
I think that it is overrated. I think that it's very expensive, complicated power, and I feel like the room to run that we have between other well-known technologies like wind and solar and storage now are much superior and have many advantages over it. So I think it's overrated.
On a similar technology note, offshore wind in the US.
Offshore wind, I've had a lot of exposure to in Europe, where it seems to make a great deal of sense, obviously, with all the projects that have been built. In the United States, it's such a different situation with so much available onshore resource that I see it as overrated.
And finally, the likelihood of further power market expansion or liberalization in the US.
I see that as underrated. I feel like even as we've just seen with Ameren considering leaving MISO for PJM, I think there's a lot of change afoot. I don't know how much market liberalization we're going to be seeing, but I do think there's going to be a lot of changes, grid reform, that are going to make things easier for the kinds of change among generators in particular that we've been seeing to accelerate.
Certainly, again, one to keep an eye on, and maybe we'll get you back on the podcast to talk about IRA repeal if and when that comes up. Well, thanks very much, Andy. I hope not too. Thanks so much for your time today. I think that's a great place to wrap up, and thank you to everyone for listening.
Very good. Thank you so much for having me.
That was Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America, talking to Andy Bowman, CEO of Jupiter Power. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.